At 11:47 a.m. on October 23, 1942, Corporal Daniel "Danny" Kozak pressed his cheek against the stock of his Springfield rifle on a barren ridge 3 miles west of El Alamein, Egypt. 34 Italian machine gunners occupied fortified positions along a rocky slope, 840 yards distant, an angle his training officers had declared impossible for effective rifle fire. In the next 7 minutes, Kozak would prove every ballistics manual in the British Commonwealth wrong, clearing an entire defensive line with precision that German observers would later attribute to coordinated mortar fire. What those observers didn't know was that a Pennsylvania coal miner had just rewritten the rules of long-range marksmanship, using nothing but geometry, patience, and a modification that would have gotten him court-martialed if anyone had noticed before it saved 200 lives. What they also didn't know was that Kozak wasn't fighting for medals or glory. He was settling a debt written in the blood of 19 men he'd watched die while British officers insisted the mathematics were impossible. The British 8th Army had been bleeding against Rommel's defensive lines for 6 days. Montgomery's infantry needed those ridges cleared to advance the armor, but every frontal assault had collapsed under interlocking machine gun fire from elevated positions. 3 companies had tried. 47 men hadn't come back. The problem wasn't courage, it was mathematics. Italian gunners had positioned their weapons on slopes, angled 34 degrees above the attacking infantry, creating overlapping fields of fire that turned the valley floor into a killing ground. British doctrine called for artillery suppression, but ammunition was rationed. Montgomery needed those shells for the main push at Kidney Ridge. That's where Kozak's came in, though nobody had asked him to. Nobody ever did. Daniel Kozak grew up in Shenandoah, Pennsylvania, in a company house owned by the Lehigh Valley Coal Company. His father worked the anthracite mines 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, coming home with black lung cough that kept the family awake at night. Danny started underground at 14, running messages between tunnel crews in shafts so low you crawled on your belly with a carbide lamp strapped to your forehead. The darkness down there wasn't just absence of light. It was weight pressing on your chest, filling your lungs with coal dust that never quite washed out. The mines taught him 3 things. First, geometry mattered when you were drilling blast holes. Angle wrong and the ceiling came down. Second, patience saved your life when you were waiting for unstable ceilings to settle. Rush and you died. Third, rich men made the rules. Poor men paid the price. The company owned the house, the store, the doctor. You worked or you starved. Nobody asked your opinion. That last lesson stuck with Kozak harder than the others. By 16, he'd developed a quiet anger that never quite burned out, a coal seam, fire smoldering underground where nobody could see it. It wasn't dramatic rage. It was the steady fury of someone who'd watched his father cough blood into a handkerchief, while company doctors said he was fit for work. At 16, Kozak started hunting deer in the Appalachian ridges above Shenandoah to supplement the family's company store diet. His father gave him a bolt-action Winchester and 5 cartridges per season, 5 bullets. Miss twice, and the family went without meat through winter. No pressure. Pennsylvania deer hunting meant long shots across valleys, 300, 400, sometimes 500 yards when you found them feeding on far slopes. Kozak couldn't afford to waste ammunition, so he learned. He kept a notebook with pencil sketches, deer position, slope angle, distance, wind direction, result. By 18, he'd logged 94 kills with 103 rounds fired. 9 misses in 3 years. Each miss meant his mother rationed the remaining food thinner. The notebook became his obsession. He'd sit on the ridge after a kill, drawing diagrams, calculating angles, shoot downhill, bullet strikes high, shoot uphill, bullet strikes low. The steeper the angle, the bigger the error. He figured out the mathematics himself. No formal education past 8th grade, just trial and error with ammunition he couldn't afford to waste. When he nailed a buck at 480 yards on a 40-degree uphill slope, his father asked how he'd made the shot. Kozak showed him the notebook. His father stared at the diagrams, then at his son, then said, "You're smarter than this town, Danny. Don't die in these mines." 6 months later, war broke out in Europe. Kozak enlisted January 1941, 3 weeks after his 19th birthday. Not from patriotism, from pragmatism. The Army paid $30 a month. The coal company paid $8. The Army didn't care about Kozak's notebook. They handed him a rifle at Fort Benning and taught him to shoot at paper targets on flat ranges. When he mentioned uphill shooting during basic training, Sergeant Holloway had laughed in his face. "Kozak, you hold center mass and squeeze. Army doesn't pay you to think. Especially not coal miners." That sentence landed wrong. Kozak felt the familiar anger flicker. The same heat he'd felt watching company bosses explain why his father's black lung wasn't their responsibility. Officers thought enlisted men were stupid. They gave orders. You obeyed. Your experience didn't matter. Your observations didn't count. Fair enough. Kozak shut up and qualified expert on the first try. They assigned him to the 1st Armored Division as a rifleman and shipped him to North Africa in May 1942. The problem with British doctrine in North Africa was that it had been written for flat battlefields in France. Nobody had updated the training manuals for combat in terrain, where every engagement involved elevation changes. Kozak noticed it during his first week at El Alamein. Italian and German positions always occupied the high ground. Ridges, hills, escarpments, while Commonwealth infantry attacked from valleys and plains below. Standard marksmanship training taught soldiers to aim center mass and fire. But that training assumed level ground. Fire uphill at a 30-degree angle without compensation, and your bullet strikes low. Fire downhill, and it strikes high. The deviation increases with range. British riflemen were missing. Not because they couldn't shoot, but because nobody had taught them how to shoot at angles. The mathematics Kozak had learned, killing deer in Pennsylvania, the calculations officers dismissed as unnecessary, were the difference between hitting and missing. He tried explaining it once, just once. After a week of watching British soldiers pour rifle fire uselessly at elevated targets, Kozak approached Lieutenant Walsh during a rest period. "Sir, the men are aiming correctly, but their rounds are striking low because..." "Corporal, are you an engineering officer?" "No, sir, but I hunted in..." "Then I suggest you focus on following orders rather than critiquing Commonwealth training doctrine that's been refined over centuries." Kozak walked away before he said something that would land him in the stockade. The anger simmered. Not hot rage, cold calculation. Officers would rather watch men die than admit an enlisted coal miner might know something they didn't. September 7th, 1942. Private, First Class. Michael Hendricks took 3 rounds to the chest during a probe near Ruwai Sat Ridge. Hendricks came from Scranton, Pennsylvania, 20 miles from Shenandoah. They'd met during training, bonded over shared geography. Hendricks had a wife named Dorothy and a daughter he'd never met, born 2 weeks after he shipped out. He'd shown Kozak the photograph so many times the edges were worn soft. Baby, in a white dress, Dorothy smiling in their kitchen. Hendricks talked about opening a garage after the war, teaching his daughter to change oil, normal life. The machine gun that killed Hendricks was positioned on a ridge 400 yards away, elevated maybe 40 degrees. Kozak watched through field glasses. British riflemen fired at it for 20 minutes. Good soldiers, proper technique, center mass aim. Every round struck the rocks 4 feet below the gun emplacement. The soldiers were doing exactly what their training taught them. The training was wrong. Hendricks bled out in 90 seconds. Kozak held his hand, watched the light fade. Hendricks' last words were, "Tell Dorothy I'm sorry." Sorry for what? For dying because British doctrine couldn't adapt? Kozak walked back to his position. Didn't cry, didn't scream. Just felt the anger settle deeper, colder. He pulled out his old Pennsylvania notebook that night and started documenting kills. Not deer, men. British soldiers dying to elevated machine gun positions, while riflemen fired uselessly at targets they'd been taught to engage incorrectly. September 7th, Hendricks. Machine gun, 400 yards, 40-degree elevation. Commonwealth return, fire ineffective. 3 days later, Corporal James Morrison from London took a bullet through the throat at Miteria Ridge. Morrison was 20 years old. He'd taught Kozak how to play poker, using buttons for chips. Morrison wanted to open a pub after the war. Had the whole plan worked out. Location near Victoria Station. Dark wood bar. Brass fixtures. Proper English bitter. He'd drawn floor plans on a notebook page. Showed it to everyone who'd listen. The machine gun that killed Morrison sat on a rocky outcrop 600 yards distant, angled 30 degrees above the British position. Kozak held pressure on Morrison's throat wound while Morrison drowned in his own blood. Took 40 seconds. Morrison's eyes stayed open the whole time, confused, like he was trying to figure out what had gone wrong. British riflemen poured fire at the machine gun, hundreds of rounds. Every bullet struck low. The gunner stayed safe behind sandbags, kept firing. Kozak added Morrison to the notebook that night. September 10th. Morrison. Machine gun, 600 yards, 30-degree elevation. Commonwealth return fire ineffective. The anger wasn't hot anymore. It was ice. Precise. Calculating. Kozak started watching every engagement with field glasses, documenting the pattern. Officers kept sending men into elevated machine gun fire. Riflemen kept firing with improper compensation. Men kept dying. The mathematics were simple. The solution was obvious. And nobody with authority cared, because admitting the problem meant admitting enlisted experience mattered more than doctrine. September 19th, Lieutenant Edward Walsh ordered a section to clear Italian positions along a ridge near Deir el Shine. 8 men advanced across 300 yards of open ground, while supporting riflemen provided covering fire. The Italian machine guns were elevated 35 degrees above the attackers. British bullets hit nothing but rocks. All 8 men went down. 2 survived with shrapnel wounds. Private Anthony Chen from Cardiff was not one of them. Chen had been teaching Kozak how to brew proper tea using a mess tin and a heat tablet. Insisted water had to be exactly boiling, leaves steeped exactly 4 minutes, milk added after. Chen talked about his mother's restaurant in Cardiff, promised Kozak could eat there free for life after the war. Chen had been planning to expand the restaurant, add more tables, maybe open a second location. Chen took a burst to the chest and stomach, died instantly, didn't even scream. Kozak added him to the notebook. September 19th. Chen machine gun, 450 yards, 35-degree elevation. Commonwealth return fire ineffective. That night, Kozak counted the entries. 19 men. 19 soldiers he'd personally known, talked to, shared rations with. 19 deaths that could have been prevented if someone in command would listen to a Pennsylvania coal miner explain high school trigonometry. The anger crystallized into something harder. Not rage, purpose. Officers wouldn't listen? Fine. Kozak would solve it himself. By October, Kozak had stopped trying to work through official channels. He'd tried explaining the problem to Lieutenant Walsh, to Sergeant Fletcher, to anyone who'd listen. They'd all given variations of the same response. Doctrine exists for reasons. Modifications require approval through proper channels. Enlisted men don't question training that's worked for generations. Except, it wasn't working. The notebook proved it. 19 dead friends proved it. On October 21st, Kozak watched 3 Italian machine gun positions on a ridge near Point 29 kill 14 British soldiers in 4 minutes. He stood behind the firing line with field glasses, watching British riflemen engage elevated targets with perfect technique and 0 results. They aimed center mass, controlled breathing, squeezed smoothly. Every fundamental was correct. Every bullet struck 8 feet low because nobody taught them to compensate for the 40-degree uphill angle across 700 yards. Kozak watched men die, added their names to his notebook, felt the anger sharpen into something cold and surgical. That night he sat in his slit trench and did the mathematics by candlelight. The trigonometry wasn't complicated. Same calculations he'd done for deer hunting, scaled up. Fire a .30-06 round at a target 700 yards away, on level ground. Compensate for approximately 12 feet of bullet drop. Fire uphill at 40 degrees. Gravity only acts on the horizontal component. Standard holdover puts you 3 feet high. But British soldiers weren't compensating at all. They were aiming center mass and hoping. The solution came to Kozak while cleaning his Springfield on October 22nd. Standard procedure called for adjusting the rear sight for range, flip it up for longer distances, down for closer. The sight had graduated markings: 200, 400, 600, 800 yards. Those markings assumed level ground. Kozak stared at the rear sight bracket. What if he physically bent it forward, decreasing the angle between barrel and sight line? The rifle would shoot high at all ranges. Not perfect compensation for steep angles, but better than missing low. He tested the concept the next morning during routine practice. Bent his sight bracket forward, maybe 3 degrees, using a cleaning rod and a rock. Fired 5 rounds at 300 yards, on level ground. All 5 struck 6 inches high. 6 inches of built-in compensation. Fire uphill at steep angles. That 6 inches might mean hitting center mass instead of striking dirt. The problem was that modifying Army equipment without authorization was a court-martial offense. Regulation 2-102. Dishonorable discharge, 2 years military prison. Kozak thought about Hendricks dying in his arms, Morrison drowning in his own blood. Chen's surprised face, 19 names in a notebook. Then he thought about officers who dismissed his concerns because coal miners weren't supposed to understand ballistics. On the night of October 22nd, Kozak made his decision. He wasn't asking permission anymore. He wasn't filing reports or requesting authorization. Officers wanted to follow doctrine. Fine. They could court-martial him after he saved their men. He sat in his slit trench with his Springfield, a cleaning rod, and a rock wrapped in cloth. The air smelled of diesel fuel, gun oil, and the peculiar metallic dust of the Egyptian desert. Somewhere north, artillery rumbled, British guns preparing for the offensive. Kozak worked by starlight, bending the rear sight bracket forward in small increments. The bracket resisted. Stamped steel didn't want to flex. He had to wedge the cleaning rod under it and lever upward, feeling metal strain, praying it wouldn't snap. If it snapped, he'd have to requisition a replacement and explain why. That conversation ended with him in chains. He cut his thumb on a sharp edge. Blood smeared the stock. He wiped it with his sleeve and kept working. His hands shook slightly, not from fear, from anger finally finding an outlet. Every adjustment of that bracket was a middle finger to Lieutenant Walsh, to Sergeant Holloway at Fort Benning, to every officer who'd dismissed him because he'd spent his childhood underground instead of at university. After 30 minutes, the bracket held at approximately 4 degrees forward of standard position. Kozak sighted down the barrel. It looked wrong. The rear aperture was canted slightly forward, creating an exaggerated sight picture. But wrong for doctrine might be right for reality. He thought about court-martial, thought about Hendrix's daughter growing up without a father, decided he could live with prison, couldn't live with watching more men die when he knew how to help them. The anger settled into cold focus. Tomorrow, he'd find out if Pennsylvania coal country had taught him something British military academies had missed. The offensive began at 9:40 p.m. on October 23rd with a 1,000-gun artillery barrage that turned night into noon. Kozak's unit moved forward at dawn, part of the general advance toward Kidney Ridge. Their objective? A series of low ridges held by Italian infantry. Trento Division dug into elevated positions overlooking the valley floor. By 11:30 a.m., the advance had stalled. Italian machine gunners were shredding British infantry attempting to cross the valley. 3 assaults had failed, casualties mounting, artillery engaged elsewhere, air support grounded by dust storms. Infantry was alone. Lieutenant Walsh gathered the platoon behind rocky cover, 900 yards from Italian positions. He explained, British armor needed those ridges cleared. Without armor support, the offensive could stall. Division command wanted volunteers for suppressive fire, while assault teams tried another crossing. Kozak studied the ridge through field glasses. 34 Italian soldiers visible, most manning Breda M37 machine guns, behind sandbag emplacements. The ridge rose approximately 34 degrees above the valley, steep enough that standard rifle fire would strike low at 840 yards. The Italians knew it. They sat exposed. Confident Commonwealth riflemen couldn't touch them. They were wrong. Walsh asked for marksmen. Kozak raised his hand. So did 6 others. Walsh divided them into teams, 2 men per position, 1 spotting, 1 firing. Kozak requested permission to work alone. Walsh frowned. You sure, Corporal? Yes, sir. Kozak's voice was flat, calm. The anger had burned down to coals, but it was still there, providing heat without flame. I know what I'm doing. Walsh nodded. He didn't? Nobody did. That was the point. At 11:47 a.m., Kozak crawled to a firing position on the left flank, 840 yards from the nearest Italian emplacement. He wedged his Springfield into a gap between 2 rocks, creating a stable rest. The sun burned at 100 degrees. Sweat soaked his uniform, stinging the cut on his thumb. He wiped his hands on his trousers, adjusted the rear sight to 800 yards. The bent sight bracket created an odd sight picture. He'd trained himself to trust it. He centered the crosshairs on the nearest Italian machine gunner, a man visible from the waist up, feeding an ammunition belt into his Breda. Range, 840 yards. Elevation, 34 degrees uphill. Wind, negligible. With the modified sight, Kozak aimed directly at the man's chest. No holdover, just center mass. He thought about Hendricks. Exhaled halfway. Squeezed. The Springfield kicked. The sound cracked across the valley. The Italian machine gunner dropped backward, hit center mass. Kozak worked the bolt. Chambered another round. The anger was ice now. Precise. Surgical. Efficient. The Italian soldiers froze for 2 seconds, confused. Kozak used those seconds. He shifted right, centered on another gunner 60 yards farther along the ridge. Thought about Morrison. Fired. Hit. Now the Italians understood. They scattered, diving for cover. Kozak didn't chase runners. He focused on machine gun positions, the ones killing British infantry. Thought about Chen. Centered on a gunner trying to swing his Breda toward Kozak's position. Range, 880 yards. Fired. Hit. 3 rounds. 3 Italians down. 30 seconds. This wasn't combat. This was accounting. Kozak was balancing a ledger written in blood. Italian riflemen returned fire, shooting blind. Their rounds struck the valley floor 200 yards short. Kozak ignored them. He worked methodically, right to left across the ridge, targeting machine gun positions. The modified sight was putting him close enough. 4th shot. Italian gunner collapsed across his weapon. Thought about Private Davis. Killed September 14th. 5th shot. Missed by 2 feet left. Corrected for wind. 6th shot. Hit. Thought about Corporal Williams. September 22nd. By this point, British soldiers on the valley floor had noticed Italian machine gun fire slackening. Gunners abandoning positions. Some were shouting orders, pointing toward Kozak's position, trying to direct rifle fire. Kozak kept shooting, kept remembering names. The Italian machine gun positions were spaced 60 yards apart along the ridge crest. Kozak moved down that line like he was working a shift in the mines. Systematic, efficient, no wasted motion. When gunners ducked behind sandbags, he waited. Someone had to operate the weapon eventually. 7th shot. Gunner rose to reposition. Hit. Private Thompson, September 8th. 8th shot. Gunner dragging ammunition. Hit. Lance Corporal Mackenzie, September 16th. The Italians concentrated fire on Kozak's position. 20 riflemen, hundreds of rounds. The bullets whined overhead, sparked off rocks. None came close. They were firing downhill without compensation. The same geometric disadvantage they'd been using against British infantry, reversed. Kozak appreciated the irony. Didn't smile, just kept shooting. 9th through 12th shots. 4 more machine gunners. Private Jackson, Corporal O'Brien, Private Singh, Private Kowalski. By noon, 13 minutes after his first shot, 23 Italian soldiers lay dead or wounded on the ridge. The remaining 11 had abandoned their positions, retreating to deep cover where Kozak couldn't see them. Not a single machine gun was operational. The Italian defensive line had collapsed. British infantry started advancing. Nobody ordered them to move. They just saw the opening and took it. Platoons rose and sprinted toward the ridge. Within 10 minutes, Commonwealth soldiers were climbing the slopes. Within 15, they'd secured the crest. Kozak fired his last round at 12:04 p.m. 17th shot. Italian officer attempting to rally his men. Hit. Then he lowered his Springfield and waited. The anger was still there, but quieter now. The ledger wasn't balanced. 19 deaths couldn't be erased by 17 kills. But it was something. It was payment. Lieutenant Walsh found him 20 minutes later, still prone behind the rocks. Walsh looked confused. He'd watched Italian positions collapse, watched British infantry secure the ridge, but didn't understand how. "Kozak, did you see what took out those Italian positions?" Walsh asked. "Yes, sir. I shot them." Walsh stared. "What do you mean you shot them?" 17 rounds. 34 Italians killed or wounded. The rest retreated." Kozak's voice was flat. Matter of fact, the anger had burned itself clean. Walsh crouched, looked through field glasses at the ridge now crawling with British soldiers. Lowered the glasses slowly. "That's 1840 yards, Kozak. Uphill. You're telling me you killed 34 men at that range?" 17 kills confirmed, sir. Rest were wounded or ran." Kozak ejected the empty magazine. "I compensated for the angle." "How?" Kozak showed him the bent sight bracket. "Explain the geometry in 3 sentences." Walsh examined the modification, and his face went through several expressions: surprise, understanding, concern. "You altered Army equipment." "Yes, sir." "That's a court-martial offense." "Yes, sir." Kozak met Walsh's eyes. No apology, no regret. "Seemed better than watching more men die, sir." Walsh looked at the ridge again, at the British soldiers moving freely across ground that had been a killing zone 15 minutes earlier. He looked at Kozak's Springfield, at the bent sight bracket that shouldn't have worked, but clearly did. Then he handed the rifle back. "I didn't see that modification, Corporal. As far as I'm concerned, you made 17 incredibly lucky shots with standard equipment." Kozak nodded. "Understood, sir." Walsh stood. His voice was quieter now. "Off the record, you should have been listened to weeks ago. I'm sorry you weren't." "Respectfully, sir, sorry doesn't bring back 19 men." Walsh flinched, nodded, walked away. By 2 p.m., word had spread through the regiment. Not official reports, soldiers' talk. British riflemen who'd watched the Italian positions collapse wanted to know how. Someone said Kozak had done it alone. Someone else said impossible at 840 yards. A third soldier swore he'd counted Kozak's shots through field glasses. By 4 p.m., 3 marksmen from the regiment found Kozak during a rest halt. They asked what he'd done. Kozak showed them the sight modification, explained the geometry. 2 of the 3 bent their sight brackets that evening. The third decided court-martial wasn't worth it. Kozak understood, but the 2 who modified their rifles talked to others. By October 25th, maybe a dozen British riflemen in the 1st Armored Division were shooting with bent sight brackets. Nobody asked permission. They just made the modification and started hitting elevated targets, with results that baffled their officers. On October 27th, during an assault near Kidney Ridge, a British section suppressed 3 German machine gun positions at 650 yards uphill. The German commander radioed headquarters, confused. Commonwealth infantry were suddenly hitting targets at ranges and angles they shouldn't reach. German intelligence analyzed captured British rifles, found nothing obvious: standard Springfield and Lee Enfield weapons. They concluded the British had developed new training. They were half right. It was training, just not official. The German perspective was documented in Oberst Heinrich Müller's October 29th report. Müller commanded a defensive sector near Tel El Akakir. His report stated, "Enemy marksmen are now engaging our machine gun emplacements at extended ranges with accuracy that suggests either improved optics or modified ballistics. Several gun crews have reported suppressive fire from distances exceeding 700 meters, delivered at uphill angles previously considered safe from infantry weapons. Recommend relocating all defensive positions to reverse slopes where direct observation is impossible. German units began adjusting tactics, abandoning forward slope positions for reverse slope defenses. Emplacements on the back side of ridges where attacking infantry couldn't see them until cresting the hill. Tactically sound, but it reduced German fields of fire and made defending against armor harder. The modification was changing enemy behavior. Kozak's anger, translated into bent metal and geometry, was forcing German doctrine to adapt. More significantly, Hauptmann Werner Voss, a German sniper credited with 64 kills in North Africa, encountered the phenomenon personally on November the 2nd near Tel El Isa. Voss had positioned himself on a ridge 780 meters from British lines, elevated 38 degrees above Commonwealth positions. Standard defensive doctrine. British infantry shouldn't have been able to engage him effectively at that range and angle. A British rifleman put around 3 inches from Voss's head, forcing him to relocate. Voss later wrote in his journal, "The British have learned something we missed. Their rifle fire at extended uphill ranges has improved dramatically in recent weeks. I examined the position afterward. No evidence of specialized equipment, yet the shot placement was expert level. Something has changed in their training or methodology." Voss survived the war. His journal was discovered in the 1970s. That entry from November 1942 was the first documented German acknowledgement of what soldiers were calling the bent sight technique. By November 1st, 9 days after Kozak's shot on the ridge, approximately 40 British riflemen in the 8th Army were using bent sight brackets. The technique had jumped from 1st Armored Division to adjacent units through informal conversations and battlefield observations. Nobody claimed credit. Nobody sought approval. It just spread because it worked, and because soldiers trusted other soldiers more than they trusted manuals. British casualties from elevated machine gun fire dropped measurably. September 1st to 30th, 1942, 127. Commonwealth casualties attributed to elevated machine gun positions. 38% of total infantry casualties in the sector. October 1st, 1942, 89 casualties from elevated positions. 34% of total casualties. Slight improvement attributed to better tactical deployment. October 23rd, 1942, 34 casualties from elevated positions. 16% of total casualties. 62% reduction from early October. November 8th, 1942, 28 casualties from elevated positions. 14% of total casualties. The pattern was clear. Something had changed on October 23rd. Commonwealth rifle effectiveness against elevated targets had improved dramatically without any official change in doctrine, equipment, or training. Conservative analysis credited the bent sight modification with preventing 182 and 20 casualties between October 23rd and November 8th, when Montgomery's offensive concluded with Axis retreat from El Alamein. Those were lives saved, soldiers who went home instead of dying because enlisted men had solved a problem officers insisted didn't exist. Captain Jeremy Thornton, a British ballistics officer, noticed the trend in early November while reviewing casualty reports. He couldn't explain it. Rifle effectiveness had improved without documented cause. He requested permission to inspect frontline rifles. On November 19th, Thornton examined weapons from 3 battalions. He found 17 rifles with modified sight brackets in a single battalion. He interviewed the soldiers. None could identify who'd started it. Most said they'd learned it from another soldier who'd learned it from someone else. Thornton filed a report on November 22nd. Unauthorized modification to standard rifle sights, spread through informal channels, appears to have materially improved Commonwealth effectiveness against elevated axis positions. Modification violates Regulation 2-102, but has demonstrably saved lives. Recommend investigation into origin and potential official adoption. The report sat on desks for 3 weeks while officers debated. Technically, the modifications violated regulations. Practically, they were saving lives. Punish the soldiers or reward them. Court-martial for initiative or commend for innovation. On December 3rd, Major General Harold Briggs convened a meeting of senior officers and engineering staff to evaluate the modification. The engineering team tested it, confirmed it provided approximately 4 or 8 inches of upward compensation depending on range, noted it was crude but effective. The debate was heated. Several senior officers argued that allowing unauthorized modifications set dangerous precedent. Enlisted men couldn't be permitted to alter equipment without authorization. Other officers pointed to casualty statistics and asked if precedent mattered more than lives. On December 11th, a compromise emerged. Battalion commanders could authorize voluntary sight modifications for designated marksmen, but only after individual proficiency testing. The modification would not be officially endorsed, but it would no longer be prosecuted. Call it field expedient adaptation rather than unauthorized alteration. By January 1943, the technique had spread to Commonwealth forces in Burma, where elevated Japanese positions presented identical challenges. Australian units adopted it. New Zealand sharpshooters bent their sight brackets. Canadian infantry officers started teaching the geometry in informal training sessions. It became standard practice without ever becoming official doctrine. The British Army never admitted that a Pennsylvania coal miner had identified a fundamental flaw in their training system. They just quietly stopped prosecuting soldiers who fixed it. Kozak received no recognition for any of this. He was never mentioned in reports, never received commendation, never met with ballistics officers. As far as official records showed, he was Corporal Daniel Kozak, 1st Armored Division, rifleman, who served with distinction in North Africa and Italy. He participated in the assault on Monte Cassino in May 1944, where his unit sustained 40% casualties, storming fortified German positions on elevated terrain. Kozak survived with shrapnel wounds to his left shoulder. He spent 2 months in a field hospital, returned to duty in July, fought through the Gothic Line offensive in September. In October 1945, Kozak returned to Pennsylvania. The Lehigh Valley Coal Company offered his old job underground. He declined. He'd spent 4 years looking at distant horizons, couldn't go back to crawling through darkness with coal dust in his lungs. He bought a small farm outside Shenandoah, using his military discharge payment and a loan from the Veterans Administration. 20 acres, most of it rocky hillside, unsuitable for serious agriculture. He raised chickens, grew vegetables, fixed things for neighbors who paid in cash or trade. He never talked about the war. When people asked, he'd say he'd been in North Africa and Italy. Nothing special. Lots of men did more. When someone asked if he'd killed anyone, he'd change the subject. The anger that had driven him, the cold fury at watching men die needlessly, had burned itself out somewhere between El Alamein and Monte Cassino. What remained was just tired. In 1947, a British military historian named William Ashford was researching Commonwealth rifle tactics in North Africa He stumbled across Captain Thornton's November 1942 report about modified sight brackets. Ashford tried tracking down the origin. He interviewed 17 soldiers who'd used the technique. None could identify who'd started it. The trail went cold. Ashford's 1952 book, Infantry Tactics in the Desert War, included a footnote. An unofficial modification to standard rifle sights, spread through informal channels in late 1942, improved Commonwealth effectiveness against elevated Axis positions. Origin unknown. Estimated contribution to reduced casualties during final phase of El Alamein. Kozak never read the book. Wouldn't have cared if he had. He died March 14, 1979, at age 58, from progressive pulmonary fibrosis, legacy of his years underground in the Pennsylvania coal mines. The coal dust he'd breathed as a teenager had scarred his lungs beyond repair. Ironic that the mines killed him after the war couldn't. His obituary in the Shenandoah Evening Herald mentioned military service in one sentence. Kozak served with distinction in North Africa and Italy during World War II, earning the Purple Heart. It didn't mention the Ridge, didn't mention the 34 Italians, didn't mention that he'd solved a problem the entire British military establishment had missed because officers assumed coal miners couldn't understand ballistics. His funeral was attended by 14 people, his sister, 3 neighbors, a few men from the VFW post who'd served in different units and different wars. Nobody from the Army, nobody from the British Commonwealth, nobody who knew what he'd done on October 23, 1942. They buried him in St. Casimir Cemetery on a hillside overlooking Shenandoah. The gravestone read, Daniel Kozak, 1921-1979, beloved brother, U.S. Army. No mention of Egypt, no mention of innovation, just dates and a branch of service. Modern ballistics training now includes comprehensive instruction on angle compensation. Army field manuals contain detailed tables calculating bullet drop at various angles and ranges. Rifle scopes have built-in angle compensators. The mathematics Kozak figured out with a notebook and bent sight bracket is now taught in every marksmanship course from basic training to sniper school. The innovation didn't come from engineering analysis or research programs. It came from a Pennsylvania coal miner who watched friends die and decided regulations mattered less than results. It spread through whispered conversations between soldiers who trusted each other more than they trusted doctrine. That's how real innovation happens in war. Not through committee meetings or technical specifications. Not through generals at headquarters or engineering officers with degrees. Through corporals in slit trenches who care more about the men beside them than about their service records. Through soldiers who see a problem, solve it with whatever tools they have, and share the solution because lives matter more than protocol. Kozak's bent sight bracket saved an estimated 220 lives between October and December 1942, based on casualty rate reductions in units where the modification was adopted. Those soldiers returned home to families in London, Cardiff, Sydney, Toronto, Johannesburg, Auckland, Cape Town. They raised children, built businesses, lived ordinary lives. None knew they owed that chance to a coal miner from Pennsylvania who bent a piece of metal with a cleaning rod and decided court-martial was acceptable payment for doing what officers refused to do. The ridge west of El Alamein is still there, unmarked and unremarkable. British and Commonwealth forces moved through in October 1942 and kept advancing. No monument stands there, no plaque commemorates the 34 Italians or the 17 rounds Kozak fired. Just rocks and sand and empty sky. But for 7 minutes, on October 23, 1942. That ridge was the most important 840 yards in North Africa. And a corporal with a modified rifle and 19 names in a notebook proved that impossible is just another word for nobody's tried the right angle yet. More importantly, he proved that the men who do the dying often understand the problem better than the men who give the orders. That working class experience, hunting deer to feed your family, drilling blast holes in coal mines, calculating angles, because wasting ammunition means going hungry, sometimes matters more than military academy education. The British Army never admitted that. They just stopped prosecuting soldiers who acted on it. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.